Democracy. In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto, one of the most famous political documents ever written. It began with these words: "A specter is haunting Europe. It is a specter of communism." Today, one would write, "A specter is haunting the world. It is the specter of democracy." From the Russian Revolution in 1917 through the recent end of the Cold War, American foreign policy was concerned with preventing the spread of communism. This was especially true immediately after World War II, when the Soviet Union expanded its sphere of influence throughout Eastern Europe. As Winston Churchill warned, an iron curtain had descended across Europe. From then on, a Cold War existed between the United States and the Soviet Union, a struggle between democracy and communism for control of governments around the world. In one famous televised encounter, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev predicted to the Vice President Richard Nixon that Nixon's grandchildren would be communists. Nixon naturally responded that Khrushchev's grandchildren would live in a democracy. Nixon later recalled that at the time he was sure that Khrushchev would be wrong about America, but that he was unsure whether his prediction about the Soviet Union would ever be realized. Over 3 decades later, it was. All the countries that once were part of the Soviet Empire now practice democracy, holding regular elections and permitting freedom of speech. Resounding demands for democracy have recently been heard in many corners of the world. In Argentina, Brazil, and other South American countries, one-party or military regimes gave way to competitive party systems and civilian governments. Over 3 centuries of white rule ended in South Africa in 1994 as a result of the first elections open to all races. In Mexico, over 7 decades of one-party rule and fraudulent elections came to an end in 2000 with the election of President Vicente Fox. Yet, despite this global move towards democracy, not everyone defines democracy the way Americans do, or think they do. Democracy is a means of selecting policymakers and of organizing government so that policy reflects citizens' preferences. Today, the term democracy takes its place among terms like freedom, justice, and peace as a word that seemingly has only positive connotations. Yet the writers of the U.S. Constitution had no fondness for democracy, as many of them doubted the ability of ordinary Americans to make informed judgments about what governments should do. Roger Sherman, a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, said the people should have as little to do as may be with the government. Only much later did Americans come to cherish democracy and believe that all citizens should actively participate in choosing their leaders. Most Americans would probably say that democracy is government by the people. This phrase, of course, is part of Abraham Lincoln's famous definition of democracy from his Gettysburg Address: government of the people, by the people, and for the people. How well each of these aspects of democracy is being met is a matter crucial to evaluating how well our government is working. Certainly, government has always been of the people in the United States, for the Constitution forbids the granting of titles of nobility. On the other hand, it is a physical impossibility for government to be by the people in a society of 280 million people. Therefore, our democracy involves choosing people from among our midst to govern. Where the serious debate begins is whether political leaders govern for the people, as there are always significant biases in how the system works. Democratic theorists have elaborated a set of more specific goals for evaluating this critical question. Traditional democratic theory rests upon a number of key principles that specify how governmental decisions are made in a democracy. Robert Dahl, one of America's leading theorists, suggests that an ideal democratic process should satisfy the following 5 criteria. Equality in voting. The principle of one person, one vote is basic to democracy. Voting need not be universal, but it must be representative. Effective participation. Citizens must have adequate and equal opportunities to express their preferences throughout the decision-making process. Enlightened understanding. A democratic society must be a marketplace of ideas. A free press and free speech are essential to civic understanding. If one group monopolizes and distorts information, citizens cannot truly understand issues. Citizen control of the agenda. Citizens should have the collective right to control the government's policy agenda. If wealthy individuals or groups distort the agenda, the people cannot make government address the issues that they feel are most important. Inclusion. The government must include and extend rights to all those subject to its laws. Citizenship must be open to all within a nation, if the nation is to call itself democratic. Only by following these principles can a political system be called democratic. Furthermore, democracies must practice majority rule, meaning that in choosing among alternatives, the will of over half the voters should be followed. At the same time, most Americans would not want to give majority free rein to do anything they can agree on. Restraints on the majority are built into the American system of government in order to protect those in the minority. Basic principles such as freedom of speech and assembly are inviolable minority rights, which the majority cannot infringe upon. In a society too large to make its decisions in open meetings, a few will have to look after the concerns of the many. The relationship between the few leaders and the many followers is one of representation. The literal meaning of representation is to make present once again. In politics, this means that the desires of the people should be replicated in government through the choices of elected officials. The closer the correspondence between representatives and their constituents, the closer the approximation to the ideal democracy. As might be expected for such a crucial question, theorists disagree widely about the extent to which this actually occurs in America. Theories of American democracy are essentially theories about who has power and influence. All, in one way or another, ask the question, who really governs in our nation? Each focuses on a key aspect of politics and government, and each reaches a somewhat different conclusion. Pluralist Theory. One important theory of American democracy, pluralist theory, states that groups with shared interests influence public policy by pressing their concerns through organized efforts. The National Rifle Association, the National Organization for Women, and the United Auto Workers are examples of groups of people who share a common interest. Because of open access to various institutions of government and public officials, organized groups can compete with one another for control over policy, and yet no one group or set of groups dominates. Given that power is dispersed in the American form of government, groups that lose in one area can take their case to another. For example, civil rights groups faced congressional roadblocks in the 1950s, but were able to win the action they seek from the courts. Pluralists are generally optimistic about the public interest will eventually prevail in the making of public policy through a complex processes of bargaining and compromise. They believe that rather than speaking of majority rule, we should speak of groups of minorities working together. Robert Dahl expressed this view well when he wrote that in America all active and legitimate groups in the population can make themselves heard at some crucial stage in the process. Group politics is certainly as American as apple pie. Writing in the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville called us a nation of joiners and pointed to the high level of associational activities as one of the crucial reasons for the success of American democracy. The recent explosion of interest group activity can therefore be seen as a very positive development from the perspective of pluralist theory. Interest groups and their lobbyists, the groups representative in Washington, have become masters of the technology of politics. Computers, mass mailing lists, sophisticated media advertising, and hard sell techniques are their stock in trade. As a result, some observers believe that Dahl's pluralist vision that all groups are heard via the American political process is more true now than ever before. On the other hand, Robert Putnam argues that many of the problems of American democracy today stem from a decline in group-based participation. Putnam theorizes that advanced technology, particularly television, has served to increasingly isolate Americans from one another. He shows that membership in a variety of civic associations such as parent-teacher associations, the League of Women Voters, the Elks, Shriners, and JCs have been declining for decades. Interestingly, Putnam does not interpret the decline of participation in civic groups as meaning that people have become couch potatoes. Rather, he argues that Americans' activities are becoming less tied to institutions and more self-defined. The most famous example he gives to illustrate this trend is the fact that membership in bowling leagues had dropped sharply at the same time that more people were bowling, indicating that more and more people must be bowling alone. Elite and class theory. Critics of pluralism believe that it paints too rosy a picture of American political life. By arguing that almost every group can get a piece of the pie, they say pluralists miss the larger question of how the pie is distributed. The poor may get their food stamps, but businesses get massive tax deductions worth far more. Some governmental programs may help minorities, but the income gap between African Americans and white remain wide open. Elite and class theory contends that our society, like all societies, is divided among class lines and that an upper-class elite pulls the strings of government. Wealth, the holding of assets such as property, stocks, and bonds, is the basis of this power. Over a third of the nation's wealth is currently held by just 1% of the population. Elite and class theorists believe that this 1% of America controls most policy decisions because they can afford to finance election campaigns and control key institutions such as large corporations. According to elite and class theory, a few powerful Americans do not merely influence policymakers, they are policymakers. At the center of all theories of elite dominance is big business. Around the turn of the century, President Woodrow Wilson charged that the masters of the government of the United States are the combined capitalists and manufacturers of the United States. President Calvin Coolidge expressed a more favorable attitude, stating, "The business of America is business." No recent president has tried harder to help big business than Ronald Reagan, and many elite theorists believe that he succeeded beyond all expectations. As Kevin Phillips wrote in his bestseller, The Politics of Rich and Poor, the 1980s was the triumph of upper America, an ostentatious celebration of wealth, the political ascendancy of the richest third of the nation population, and a glorification of capitalism, free markets, and finance. It is doubtful that anything like this will be written about the Clinton administration. However, journalist Bob Woodward, accountant of Clinton's first year in office, argues that many promises made in Clinton's Putting People First program were sacrificed to satisfy the demands of Wall Street. Elite theorists maintain that who holds office in Washington is of marginal consequence. The corporate giants always have the power. Hyperpluralism. A third theory, hyperpluralism, offers a different critique of pluralism. Hyperpluralism is pluralism gone sour. In this view, groups are so strong that government is weakened, as the influence of many groups cripples government's ability to make policy. Hyperpluralism states that many groups, not just the elite ones, are so strong that government is unable to act. Whereas pluralism maintains that input from groups is a good thing for the political decision-making process, hyperpluralism asserts that there are too many ways for groups to control policy. Our fragmented political system contains governments with overlapping jurisdictions is one major factor that contributes to hyperpluralism. Too many governments can make it hard to coordinate policy implementation. Any policy requiring the coordination of the national, state, and local levels of government can be hampered by the reluctance of any one of them. According to hyperpluralists, groups have become sovereign and government is merely their servant. Groups that lose policy-making battles in Congress these days do not give up the battle. They carry it to the courts. Recently, the number of cases brought to state and federal courts has soared. Ecologists use legal procedures to delay construction projects they feel will damage the environment. Businesses take federal agencies to court to fight the implementation of regulations that will cost them money. Labor unions go to court to secure injunctions against policies they fear will cost them jobs. The courts have become one more battleground in which policies can be effectively opposed as each group tries to bend policy to suit its own purposes. These powerful groups divide the government and its authority. Hyperpluralist theory holds the government gives in to every conceivable interest in single-issue group. When politicians try to placate every group, the result is confusing, contradictory, and muddled policy, if politicians manage to make policy at all. Like elite and class theorists, hyperpluralist theory suggests that the public interest is rarely translated into public policy. Challenges to democracy. Regardless of which theory is most convincing, there are a number of continuing challenges to democracy. Many of these challenges apply to democratic theory as well as to the fledgling democracies around the world. Increased technical expertise. Traditional democratic theory holds that ordinary citizens have the good sense to reach political judgments and that governments has the capacity to act on those judgments. Today, however, we live in a society of experts whose technical knowledge overshadows the knowledge of the general population. What, after all, does the average citizen, however conscientious, know about eligibility criteria for welfare, agricultural price supports, foreign competition, and the hundreds of other issues that confront government each year? Alexander Hamilton, the architect of the American economic system and George Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, once said that every society is divided into the few and the many. He argued that the few will rule, the many will be ruled. Years ago, the power of the few, the elite, might have been based on property holdings. Today, the elite are likely to be those who command knowledge, the experts. Even the most rigorous democratic theory does not demand that citizens be experts on everything. But as human knowledge expands, it has become increasingly difficult for individual citizens to make well-informed decisions. Limited participation in government. When citizens do not seem to take their citizenship seriously, democracy's defenders worry. There is plenty of evidence that Americans know little about who their leaders are, much less about their policy decisions, as we will discuss at length in Chapter 6. Therefore, Americans do not take full advantage of their opportunities to shape government or select its leaders. Limited participation in government challenges the foundation of democracy. In particular, because young people represent the country's future, their abysmal turnout rates point to an even more serious challenge to democracy on the horizon. Escalating campaign costs. Many political observers worry about the close connection between money and politics, especially in congressional elections. Winning a House seat these days usually requires a campaign war chest of at least $500,000, and the Senate races are even more costly. Candidates have become increasingly dependent on political action committees to fund their campaigns because of the escalating campaign costs. These PACs often represent specific economic interests, and they care little about how members of Congress vote on most issues, just the issues that particularly affect them. Critics charge that when it comes to the issues PACs care about, the members of Congress listen, lest they be denied the money they need for their re-election. When democracy confronts the might of money, the gap between democratic theory and reality widens further. Diverse political interests. The diversity of the American people is reflected in the diversity of interests represented in the political system. As will be shown in this book, this system is so open that interests find it easy to gain effective access to policymakers. Moreover, the distribution of power within the government is so decentralized that access to a few policymakers may be enough to determine the outcome of public policy battles. When interests conflict, which they often do, no coalition may be strong enough to form a majority and establish policy, but each interest may use its influence to thwart those whose policy proposals they oppose. In effect, they have a vote over policy, creating what is often referred to as policy gridlock. In a big city, gridlock occurs when there are so many cars on the road that no one can move. In politics, it occurs when each policy coalition finds its way blocked by others. This political problem is magnified when voters choose a president of one party and congressional majorities of the other party, as has often been the case in recent years. The result is nothing may get done, even if action is widely desired by a clear majority of voters. For example, in the early 1990s, most people in the United States felt that the country faced a crisis in health care, yet President Clinton was unable to overcome the opposition of various interests to fashion a comprehensive proposal that could pass Congress, or even with Democratic majorities in both the House and Senate, in 1993 and 1994. Democracy is not necessarily an end in itself. For many, evaluations of democracy depend on what democratic government produces. Thus, a majority challenge to democracy in America is to overcome the diversity of interests and fragmentation of power in order to deliver policies that are responsive to citizens' needs.